Okay, so part 2 of the sampling plan. So step 4 is determining sample size. So how many people do we need to talk to get a good reflection of our population? So really there are 3 basic things that we need to look at. Is when we look at the population as a whole, how diverse or how many variations are there? The more diverse the population that we have, the larger the sample size we're going to need. So, looking at diversity and determining, if we would, on a scale of maybe 1 to 10, how would we rank diversity? Degree of precision or the degree of error. So how precise do we need to be? Obviously, in a perfect world, we would want it to be absolutely, 100% accurate. But that's really not achievable unless we are going to go with a census. Even if we go with a census, we're not, unless we're the U.S. government, but look at how much money they spend trying to get every single member of the population to respond to the census every 10 years. So, the fact is we're going to have some error in there, but we really need to look at how precise we need to be. What is the degree of error that we can live with? So if you think about, in the elections, when they are doing the reporting and they'll give you a degree of error of, 1 or 2 points, that means, basically if I'm saying 95% of the population believes in this statement with 2 points of error, then I'm basically saying anywhere from 93 to 97 within that range. So how tight do we need that range of error? And then the third one is the degree of confidence. Again, the more confidence we want, the higher the level of confidence in our results, the larger the sample size. Okay, so in most cases, we can put up with a certain amount of error and a certain amount of less confidence. So it's really a matter of, some of this is actually based on how much risk are we willing to take. We have the risk of making a decision with no information. So any information we have gives us a little more criteria or a little more confidence in what we're saying. So the more people we talk to, the greater the level of confidence and the more precise our research is going to be. So seems kind of odd, but the actual size of the population doesn't really have a whole lot of bearing on the size of the sample. It's more based on how diverse the population is, the precision or amount of error you're willing to have, and the confidence. That's all what drives sample size. If you have a very similar population, not a lot of diversity, then we can just talk to a few people or a fewer number of people to get an overall view of what the entire population thinks. So that's where, some of these other considerations, which we don't really often like to think about, but they do come into play, is, how much budget do we have? The larger the sample size, the more it's going to cost us to recruit and actually gain that information and interview, especially if we're doing personal interviews, phone interviews, mailing interviews. What kind of analysis are we going to do? There are going to be some minimum requirements with some of the statistics that you're going to use. Again, in our study that we're going to do, and in most of the studies that I do for my clients, we use just basic statistics. So they're more informational. We're making some pretty good, size decisions based on the information. But again, it's some of the risks that we're willing to take and some of the knowledge that we already have, and this is just kind of adding more more solid information to help us sway one way or another. And the other thing that we're going to do is we'll also look at past research. In a lot of cases, a lot of these research companies will have some, basically a history of the sample sizes that they've used in similar studies and how well that was a predictor. So, these criteria or considerations do often come into play, especially the budget and the type of analysis that we're going to be doing. So then selecting the sample elements. Okay, so when we're looking at the elements, we're talking about error. We've got lots, 5 different types of error that we need to think about. The first one is our sampling error. So what is the difference between the results we got from the sample and the overall population? That's our sampling error. We can decrease the amount of our sampling error by increasing the sample size. Okay? We can pretty much, if we use a probability sample, we're better able to estimate how much of a sampling error we're going to have. Sampling errors are usually not as troublesome as some of the other areas. They're a lot easier for us to control. Non-sampling errors are things that arise from the research itself. Things like, where do we get this idea, the logic that we're using to pull the information, the questions, how we're interpreting the questions, how well we wrote the questions, and how the respondents interpret them and replied, the statistics that we're using, the statistical equations and techniques. Believe it or not, there can be arithmetic errors, analyzing errors, coding errors, and reporting errors. Those are all what we would call non-sampling errors. They're errors that really come from the process that we've put together in putting the survey tool together, and then really the way that we've developed the questions, the order, and things like that. And then how we handle the results once we get them in. So these are all things that we can't account for statistically, but we can minimize by doing pre-testing, by paying attention to detail, really going through and being very conscientious and detail-oriented in our development of the tool, development of the whole sampling procedure and the questionnaire. Non-coverage errors. Again, this goes back to when we described our population. Did we think about all of the relevant elements and the diversity? Did we get, were we sure that we have representation from each of the sections within that population? Was our sampling frame good? Okay. If we have a subset that wasn't discovered or didn't respond, then we have a sampling frame error. If we didn't pull that element in, so we did not get a response from them, so we don't know what they think. So you can see how each part of this process is so important in taking away the errors and increasing the confidence. Again, it's a lot of common sense if you really think about it. But again, to really break it down and by breaking it into these steps, it's forcing us to think about each one of these things, which in the end, that attention to detail up front in the development of the procedure is going to yield us much better data in the end. Non-response error. How many of you have picked up the phone and they say, I'd like to ask you a few questions, and you hang up? That's a non-response error. People who do not want to respond, maybe they're not home, maybe they don't answer. Really good example here is that when universities and colleges like Western send out a salary survey after 5 years after somebody's graduated, how likely are those graduates going to be in responding? If you're happy with your salary, you may be more likely to respond. If you're not so happy with your salary, you may be, hey, this, you may not be happy with your salary, so therefore you're kind of saying, hey, you guys, I almost wanting to either respond to the college because you want them to know that their initial results weren't as accurate or not. So again, your mood can impact whether you're going to respond to a survey or not. But if we think about the non-response error, if we say, if we're going to, out of 5,000 students, we're going to talk to 250, well, what if 50 say, no, I'm not going to respond, they hang up when we call, they don't return the completed survey, then we only actually have 200. So now what do? We wanted 250, we only have 200. Do we have to go back and do it again? So working in and thinking about a certain percentage of the population may not respond, or sample may not respond to the results. So working that in to our sample size so that we are sure to get enough surveys responses so that we can have a large enough sample size. Again, more non-response, refusals, not at home, callbacks. Again, some of the ways that you can get around these things. Then we have a response error. Okay, response errors are when the response is not accurate. Maybe they've misunderstood the question. If it's a fixed set of answers, the answer that they really want, it's not an all-inclusive group of or set of answers, so they have something there that doesn't really fit their criteria, so they just mark one. The wording may bias how they answer it, or they may really not want to give a true answer. You don't often see this as much in written surveys, but telephone surveys, personal interviews, we sometimes don't want to say, no, your service really is not great, or is really bad. A lot of people may not want to say that to somebody that they're talking to either on the phone or face to face. So we do have some response error in there that, again, by working and pre-testing and really thinking about our questions and the sensitivity of our questions and the wording of our questions and how we're asking for the responses to make sure that we have an inclusive set of responses, can minimize the amount of response error that we will have. Then the last ones here, or not last ones, I guess, the last one that in this kind of grouping are office errors. Editing, coding, and analysis. Those can be reduced, but we do need to make sure that we're very detail oriented and try and minimize those office errors as much as possible. Calculation errors, looking at response rates. This is, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on this because it's something I just want you to think about, look at, but I'm not expecting you to be able to calculate what the response rate should be, but knowing that when we send out a direct mail piece, if we have a response rate of 15%, what does that mean? So just how they look at it, response rate is looking at the completed interviews as compared to the number of eligible units, so the number of attempts that we made to get a response. So that's going to give us what our response rate is. And so it's different based on how you do it. If we're doing a web-based or a mail survey, obviously we're not always sure how many people that, we've sent it out. Maybe we've emailed it to a long list. We have a certain number of bad addresses, certain number of questionnaires that aren't completely answered. So all of those things come into figuring out our response rate. Oh, sorry, I clicked right through that one again. Telephone surveys has another set of variables that we look at. Completed interviews, refusals, and not at homes. Telephone surveys, we can also look at, with an eligibility requirement versus the last one was no eligibility requirement. An example. Again, I'm not going to kind of go through all these. These slides will be available on Blackboard. But, all of that looks at how can we improve response rate. If we're going out and sending and taking the effort to ask people to respond, how can we get more responses? So, because the more responses that we have, the overall quality of our data is much better. It also is, we can think about why are people not going to respond. Long surveys. People don't like long surveys. What can we do to make sure that we're going to get the highest response rate? If we mail a survey out and it's 10 pages, how many people are likely to fill that out? If you think about the census, there's the short form and the long form. More people are apt to fill out the short form. The long form is really, really long. If you've ever seen it, it's cumbersome. So again, that's why it's so important that we only ask the questions that we really need, because you're better off getting that really important information. You're not going to get every bit of information that you want, because people aren't going to sit and answer 25 questions. In my experience, 10 is about what you're going to get the best response rate from, because even if they go through and they answer 15 through 20, how much attention are they really paying to on each of those questions? So survey length, confidentiality tends to be really big on improving response rate. If you're doing any kind of telephone or personal interview, the person and the personality helps. Personalization, incentives. If somebody includes a dollar bill or a $5 bill, are you more likely to feel obligated to answer the survey than not? And then sometimes the follow-up surveys can help you gain better response rates. So again, all of this information, I don't expect you to be whizzes at doing all of this. It's an exposure thing. In this week's assignments, there are some tools that are out there that are pretty handy, like through SurveyMonkey on calculating sample size, that we're going to play with and use in this week's exercise. So again, this is expose you to all of us to get you to think about it, but I certainly don't expect you to be able to reproduce all of this from this one class. This is basically an introduction to it. If you do get a job in a marketing research firm, they're going to have their own techniques. They're going to teach you this information, and you will learn through that method. So if you have questions on this, please feel free to ask them at the bottom of this post. Join me on Tuesday nights between 6 and 8 p.m. and we can chat about it, or use the water cooler. Hopefully I didn't put you all to sleep. I'm sorry this was so long.